Hi, and welcome everyone to the Purpose Turn. My name is Ingrid, and I have the pleasure to be here today with Shanley Knox Harruthoonyan. Welcome, Shanley.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
When I first reached out to Shanley and wanted to talk about purpose, I was impressed by her background, and it seemed like from early on, she always had chosen something purposeful as her next career. And when I approached her, I wanted to talk about purpose versus profit. And the immediate response of her was, well, for me, purpose begets profit. So I'm like, okay, let's have a conversation, because for a lot of professionals out there who spend their life chasing success, becoming profitable, and who are now in a situation where they want to embrace purpose. Purpose has this stigma that if we engage with purpose, if we find something purposeful, we need to take a pay cut. We might have to settle for a nonprofit. We have to take a step back in our careers. We might not be, as everyone that I have been talking to had kind of a script, kind of an idea of what it means, and that purpose is sacrifice.
Mm.
Now, if you are in that boat, I'm super happy to welcome Shanley and talk to her about how we all got it wrong and how purpose actually begets profit. Shanley, before we dive into the weeds, tell us a little bit about what you're doing to be purpose-led profitable.
Yeah, I run a startup. I went full time actually just this year. So that's recent, but I've been working on it for a while. And we work in transparency and supply chains. So instead of a certification or something where, you know, kind of the typical things you might think of in a supply chain, like, okay, something's fair trade or something like that. We actually go into the supply chain and we talk to the workers in the supply on WhatsApp, on the phone, whatever it is, and we get their perspective and get data directly from them. And then we pass that through to brands to actually communicate what's happening from the perspective of the people in the supply chain.
So you're not just a label, you actually have the data to prove that whatever
Yeah,
goes into a product is sustainable.
exactly. Or ethical. Yeah, we do stuff with like social data and around living wages. We also do environmental data. And then soon we'll be working with chemicals as well.
How did that came about? Why is it that you're doing that? Because when we talk about purpose, there's probably a reason behind you creating the startup.
Yeah, I think that it sort of comes back, I think, to how I define purpose, which took me a long time to get to. My early career, I was working in development work. I was living in East Africa. I was working in manufacturing. I was also, because that wasn't paying me usually at all, every once in a while it was, I was also doing freelance brand work. And really at that point, I was like in my early 20s. I don't think I really minded like the financial sacrifice. I mean, it was hard, but I had time to work two jobs, but I felt really empty doing that. And I think everyone around me was like, oh, you're doing this amazing thing. You're living in Africa. You're doing really important work. And so I kind of kept coming back to like, what's wrong with me that I'm not finding purpose in something that appears so purposeful from the outside. So I ended up shutting that down and spending a lot of time like in consulting, just like, okay, I'll focus on this. And really, I think found that for me, purpose had like much more scaffolding to it than just like, is this a meaningful topic for me? So I'm actually working on a lot of the same things I was, but I
Mm.
think through a lot of that consulting work and corporate work, I realized I love working at the intersection of many different roles and helping people understand each other. That's meaningful to me. I don't love manufacturing physical products. I love working with language. I love working internationally. I love traveling. I get really excited by power dynamics and helping kind of the little guys speak up. So it was a lot of threads that I don't think when I first was like, I'm going to work with poverty in Africa, I wouldn't have what elements of those mattered to me. So I
Mm.
had to find my way into learning all of that.
How did you figure that out?
I think for me, I'm a frameworks person for sure. I spent a long time as a brand strategist. So for me, systems change strategy was really helpful. There's a lot of frameworks in it. I did like a year-long course during COVID with an organization called Forum for the Future. They're actually a partner of my startup now. They had a systems change school, and they had all these frameworks for how you look at a problem or how you look at a field and understand different people's roles within it. And maybe someone is a disruptor and someone else is mending the disruption, someone else is helping scale it, someone else is helping stabilize. So kind of shining a light on what are all these different ways that you could be part of something. I think the other really helpful piece was that it gave me a lot of frameworks to look and see almost a different take on like product market fit or jobs to be done, where you're kind of looking at like a complex problem or a social issue or something. And instead of first just going with like, what lights me up about this, you're looking at what's already being done well, who's already adjacent to this purpose, who's against this purpose. So you're really seeing the whole constellation of who's involved with something and then looking at how you can join. And those were two, I think, frameworks that really changed my perspective on how to think about things and kind of helped me find my way.
Interesting. Let's unpack that for a second. So, the way I understand you is that this systems approach allowed you to deeper understand an issue you were interested in. And then, with that, unpack the different stakeholders that work for, against, or with that issue, which then allowed you to say, hey, wait a sec, this issue is important to me. And based on what I enjoy, which is kind of the, if you like, the selfish part of
Yeah,
purpose,
totally.
because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's
Yeah.
about us.
Yeah.
Based on
Exactly.
what I enjoy, this is a role that I want to take in this ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's based on what you enjoy, and then I almost think of the system as scaffolding. I don't think that, at least for me, like, I'm someone that, I think a lot of founders do, but, like, has anxiety or has days where I'm wondering if I'm crazy, and so I felt like if I'm really gonna if I'm really gonna do something big, there needs to be more than just, like, I find meaning in this every day, emotionally. And so I think it was also where is their real market here? Who are the people in this ecosystem that have the same goal as me and need help? I had spent a lot of time working in supply chains and seen, a lot of people claiming really positive things. And then I would go visit the supply chain and see something totally different. And I knew that those people weren't like ill meaning. So trying to see like, okay, the solution wasn't just for me to create my own facility. I didn't feel exceptionally good at that. I didn't love it. So what is something that I can bring that I have an edge at, I'm good at, but also that helps others in the purpose while also, being something that they need and can use. And I think of it like finding triple bottom line, but it's a little more nuanced where you're looking for the purpose, but you're also the profit part. You kind of have a double accountability to something that is meaningful with purpose, but is also something people want and will use. And that then drives towards the purpose and it becomes this virtuous cycle. But I think it takes a little more upfront time to discover what that is.
I really love how you just framed purpose and business in the same like model and equation, because for a lot of people that's not normal, and it makes a lot of sense, right? In order for something to be purposeful, it needs to contribute to something larger, which like oftentimes equates to other people being involved and you not being alone. And like then the question is, how do I become part of that? When you think about the profitability of you, how do you approach that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, specifically with our company, when we first started, I thought I would raise VC. And when I talked to VCs, their feedback was that I needed to be, or at least one VC that I had a lot of conversations with, was that I needed to charge a certain amount for our solution. And that was really benchmark with what was in the market. And I felt that from the analysis I had done, charging that amount actually excluded a lot of people that I wanted to serve. And so I was really inspired by things like, M-Pesa, which is like a solution in East Africa, which is hugely profitable and also serving a lot of impoverished communities. And so I knew that I wanted to work with a lot of smaller manufacturers and smaller brands. And I didn't believe you had to work with companies that were hugely scaled. I wanted to be able to serve the family led manufacturer in India that's doing really good work, that wants to be able to talk about their sustainability and can't afford a $50,000 enterprise solution. So to me, that was a constraint of who I wanted to serve and who I wanted to work with. And that really led our pricing strategy. But it was also something that became really meaningful when I would go and I would work with our initial clients where we would talk about scale together and we would talk about how that worked. One of our first clients in Peru, who I'm still working with, I was my idea was we won't charge the manufacturers anything and then we'll just charge brands, which was kind of the status quo in the market. And I was like stuck in traffic outside Lima coming back from their factory and they called and were like, "Hey, we've been talking through this. We're going to pay you. And this is kind of how we think you should sell it up into brands with us. So it works for our company, and this is how it would be meaningful to us. And we think it would drive the business." And so I think in having these more meaningful relationships and having these deeper conversations and thinking about pricing within the greater kind of shared purpose, it actually can get you to innovative models, at least in my
Mm.
experience.
When you started, it sounded like a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Somebody that's
Totally.
very like single bottom line minded being like, "Hey, you got to charge for this," right?
Right.
And then
Yeah.
you being like, "Yeah, no, like this is not in line with what I had in mind." And of course, then it's the question for you, okay, how do I balance this? How do I balance profitability with the impact that I want to see? And what I find beautiful about what you shared is how being transparent about that led to more openness. And it seems like almost like a partnership level engagement and connection with the people you're working with. It was not just like service provider in terms of here's the product, give me your money, but it's like, how can we be in this together?
Right. Which I think was also a huge part of purpose for me. I see our clients multiple times a year. I'm going to a trade show next week with someone who's a client that has been in Pakistan for several months. And then we actually went on vacation with our with my Peruvian client earlier this year. And I think that has been just a huge part of making this work meaningful for me and knowing kind of what scale I wanted it to sit at, that I wanted it to be this generational business. I wanted it to drive profit, but I didn't need it to necessarily be VC scale.
Mm.
And I think part of that was knowing how much I get out of deep relationships where I know like I'm behind our customers and we're growing together, and which is really in some ways another name for product led growth. Like we're working with them and then they sell the product and up into brands, but it has to be meaningful for them. It has to be something they feel good about. And that, you know, in turn like creates more meaning for me and more growth for the business. But it's all kind of intertwined. And I think that feels very meaningful to me, that kind of accountability between the purpose and the innovation and the business, and that they can sit in tension and serve each other versus just being a trade off.
It sounds wonderful, especially in terms of what you said earlier, what you wanted out of it, which was, for example, international travel, right? And also, you briefly mentioned the intergenerational aspect, thinking about your kids. And I'm curious because this sounds really complex, right? And it seems like based on your studies and being fascinated by system complexity, something that doesn't scare you. But how did you figure out how this would look like? Because I assume when you started, this looked maybe a little different.
Yeah, totally. I think a little differently than just like a typical business. I came in with what you might call a theory of change. So I had looked a lot at the ecosystem. I had interviewed different people. I got a little bit of funding to try out, just like, hey, I have this idea. I probably did like 50 to 100 different interviews with all different people throughout the supply chain. And then I took that and formed an of where there could be a catalyst for change in supply chains, for kind of the more upward you go in a supply chain towards the farm, the less profit, the less kind of power someone has. And I knew I kind of wanted to flip that on its head. I had no idea that the tool would be data and communication. So I walked trade shows and started talking to people. And I met our first client out of Peru that way. And then I was on a plane a couple weeks later and we sort of built the product together, like where they would say, we wish it would do this, we're wanting it to do this. And then we got a couple more clients to do that with. Some of the clients we took on, we ended up not continuing with because they weren't a right fit. I never thought I would fire a client, but I did that a few times. And then, yeah, there was kind of a moment where I was like, maybe I'm crazy and this is not going to scale and we'll only ever have two clients. And then it started working. There was kind of an unlock moment. But yeah, it was definitely this like back and forth, having a real user at the center, under making sure I was building for the right person and the right persona.
Curious here because it seemed like initially you build a business for the people you want to serve, which are these small manufacturers, right? That are ethical in the way they develop their products, treat their people, so on and so forth. But you are basically operating a solution that is a two-sided business model. So you have the suppliers on the one side and somebody who eventually, hopefully, buys it on the other. So how did that work out? And what is the impact of purpose on that side of the business?
Yeah. So I didn't think from the beginning that suppliers would be our clients. And ideally, we scale into brands and we've started seeing some traction on that. But I did not think that I would charge them anything. And there were actually people that critiqued me at the beginning and said, manufacturers don't have money to pay for this. Why are you charging them? Kind of thought I was doing something gross. And I would say we're still finding a little bit of our product market fit, right? Like we have $1 billion company that's working with us that just signed on. We have mid-tier level, we have some huge manufacturers. We have like a few different tiers of customers where we're working through like what is the real ICP? Are there a couple of them? But coming back to the purpose, something I kept thinking about was something I learned in international development, which was that the person that pays is often the person with the power. So, for example, if you're building a well in a small village and no one's paying for anything, the well will often go dormant. But if you have a village that's paying a little bit of money for the upkeep, often it becomes like wildly more successful. And what I had noticed in other tools in the market that were built for transparency is they were built for brands and suppliers hated using them. And suppliers kept telling us, I will pay for something different than what I am using, and I will sell it up into brands because I hate the tools I have so much. So I think sometimes this balance of like purpose, power dynamics, like these things, finding your actual customer persona and who your buyer is, like they're actually more closely linked than we think. So that was where it came back to the people I'm really building for are these manufacturers. And it's great that they actually end up being the buyers and pushing me to let them be the buyers. So that was kind of cool.
Amazing. And it sounds like what you just described was that the purpose of the existing solutions was to serve the brand and not the people that had the product, right? But the power dynamic was you had one player and you had hundreds of small players, right? And this one player kind of forced everybody to do something that wasn't really working. And what you came in with, what you find purposeful, played into that power dynamic in a very impactful way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been really fun to see that. Yeah. We're still early, but we're starting to see it shift in some places. So it's been pretty cool. Yeah.
When it comes to purpose, I'm curious, what are the moments in which you feel like what we're doing here, this right now is of purpose to me? What are these moments?
Yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with relationships. Like we have a client in India that like 9 different suppliers will get on a call together each week, which is really rare. People talk about panels where like the whole supply chain is on board. They're not. Like usually it's one supplier, and they're like everybody's here. So it was very cool to see a ginner and a spinner and a fabric mill and a cut and sew and kind of and a dyer. Like all come together. I think for me, it's a lot of moments where light bulbs go off for people. I think that environmental data gathering and transparency has not intentionally excluded suppliers, but it feels a lot like that moment when you don't want to ask the question you really have because you think it's stupid. And I find a lot of meaning in being a safe space for people to ask that question. Like suppliers will pull us aside at trade shows sometimes and be like, I don't understand the difference between these two things and I'm selling it. Can you help me understand this? Or we're asking them for like basic data and no one's ever walked them through the why or the what or given them back their own footprint so they could see it. So a lot of those light bulb moments for people where it's like, oh, I understand and now I'm actually involved and I have some agency are really fun for me. I think that's definitely a purposeful moment. And then I think sometimes being able to get data that previously people thought they couldn't, like being able to see farm data come through in a traditionally opaque supply chain in China or something like that, where it's like, hey, we did it. So there's those moments of like, we did a thing, but I think even more so, there's a lot of moments with our client where we're like empowering them and it's like, hey, you did a thing, because we actually made this understandable or easier or something you could engage with.
It's really interesting because the way you describe it is like what is ultimately meaningful to you also shows up in your product, right? It's your
Right.
product
Yeah.
is creating a safe space for people to communicate and bringing people together through that solution and creating light bulb moments for your suppliers, for the people that work with, for the brand that's ultimately purchasing. So it seems very aligned with who you are and like what you value uniquely.
That is true. Yeah, I guess that's true.
Based on your journey and based on what you have experienced over the years, what
Mm.
would you say that if somebody is curious about the economy or economics of their purpose, how should they start thinking about it or engaging in solving that for themselves?
I think one of the most basic things that I wish I had done sooner was rethinking my relationship with money and what I thought about money. I had a parent that was like, "Yeah, you wanna do something purposeful. It's not like you're in this for the money. It's not like you're ever really gonna make money." And I had that voice in my head, and I didn't realize that I needed to kind of grapple with that voice and find what my own belief and voice was before I could figure out what the model was. And so I think there's certainly a lot of belief that a lot of us carry around how we build wealth or how we make money.
Hmm. What's your belief right now?
My husband and I have been talking about a lot of this because both our careers are kind of taking off at the same time, which is fun but terrifying. And the cash flows are not, they're there, they're just not always easy. I do think it takes a lot of work to get to the point where you're ready to kind of be fully fledged and live in your full purpose and make money that way. And I think it's a little bit scary because to me, the biggest thing wasn't like all the interviews or finding the model or any of that. It was actually dealing with my fear. I think it was much easier to have a pretty great freelance career where I could walk into a corporate building and be good at my job and then be the girl that was building a startup on the side. And so I always could feel good about myself in some way that it was like, I'm doing this thing over here, plus I'm doing this. I'm doing more than other people, and to kind of
Mm.
be like, okay, I'm actually going to test out if I can do this one thing that I feel like carries a lot of my identity in it really well was terrifying. It was like people are actually going to see me. I might be terrible at it. I might not be able to make it work. And I've said I was doing it for so long. What if I can do a lot of this work for clients and I can't do it for myself? So it was a lot of those. I think about it a lot like almost like coming back to a sport you did when you were a kid, where it's like, do I remember how to play this? But there's also that feeling that comes with it, which I think is my favorite part of it, where it's like, I actually got out on the field and I practiced something in front of people, with people, alongside people, which is so fundamentally human and very freeing, even when you're bad at it. So I think that was a big shift for me to think of it more like play. Almost think of this like a sport. Like you're going to get better at something, you're going to figure out something, and when it has to do with your purpose, that's going to feel more scary because you're actually showing yourself, but it's all going to get, so much more.
And then coming back to the money part, is that basically when you feel like, oh, this is so scary. I'm not sure if I'm going to succeed. And then having your livelihood and your kids' livelihood depend on that. Is that the scary part? Or where did the money attitude enter the equation?
I think a lot of it was emotionally scary. I think for me, definitely the money was a scary piece of it. I also kept freelancing until like we took some angel investment and then I kept doing corporate work and kind of feeding the business. And I waited to really fully quit until I knew the startup's making enough for the next like 6 months that I know I can go full time and take a salary. And like I don't have the next 2 years planned out, but I knew if I give myself this amount of time that I know I can pay the bills and I have this runway, then I can keep extending the runway. And I believe I can do that. I think a lot of people get into purposeful work that, you'll see a lot of people go into it that have family backgrounds or have sources of income or a spouse supporting them. And I didn't have that. So it was really different for me
Hmm.
to figure out what's my version of going all in and when is it okay for me. So my path looked a little different than others.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, you have two kids, right?
I do. Yeah.
And when did that happen? Did that happen before kids or during kids?
I quit my first business when I was pregnant with my first son. I think both my sons have like ignited something in me where it was like, I'm doing something I don't really love. I had a bad dynamic with my co founder, and it was like, am I going to have this kid and tell him would I want him to do this? So that was really a
Mm.
catalyst for quitting that. And then the second business, I really started building it I had gotten to know someone who's now my architect dev and sort of shared the idea I was working on with him probably 4 weeks after my second son was born. And he started mocking something up and working on it with me. But I think it sort of gave me the courage to not care as much. I have kind of this sacred moment in early motherhood, at least. I don't know about general parenthood, but where you have this kind of ferocity where it's like, why not me? I just made a human. So I just kind of rode that wave of courage.
Amazing. And I love that you not only doing it for yourself and for the businesses that you're serving, but also for your children. And like you talked about making this a generational
Mm.
business. So it's also purposeful that way.
Yeah, I certainly wanted them to have that. That was a big piece for me.
Okay. Shanley, thank you so much for joining us here today, talking
Thank you.
about the economics of purpose and how you put purpose before profit and how that unfolded for you in a very impactful way. I wish you all the best for your future. I'm looking forward to see where this journey takes you. And for those of you out there that are interested in Shanley's story and her startup, Shanley, where can they learn more about you and your startup?
Yeah. So our website is Able Ecosystems, ABLE ecosystems.com. Or definitely folks can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Shanley, thanks again and have a beautiful day.
You too.